This is Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield, a podcast that resources families and friends with tools to have important conversations about mental and emotional health. This show is sponsored by Mayfield Counseling Centers, helping you find clarity, hope, and purpose. Here's your host, Trever Shirin.
We are back on Candid Conversations. I am Trevor and joined always by Dr. Mark Mayfield.
What's up?
We are recording at a more decent hour, kind of.
What time is it?
It's like 8 something.
Okay, I'm still not awake.
Yeah, almost 8:30. So we've got our coffee and we are ready to go.
Well, we'll have to say, last time we talked, I think, with our listeners, we were talking about the snow and all that craziness, and it's nice that it's summertime finally.
Yep, it feels like summertime. It's been real nice. Today, Dr. Mayfield and I are going to be talking about this concept called the value of a person. And, you know, my mom tried to teach me this throughout my lifetime, and she called it the preciousness of others. And I think it has a lot of different names. It probably has a lot of different names, but I want to see if we can come up with our own Candid Conversations version of what to name this concept.
It better not be another 5-part series.
No.
Okay.
No, we're avoiding that. There was a lot last time.
Oh, it's interesting because you've traveled some, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, have you been overseas?
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's interesting if you have this kind of idea of the value of a person and you go to different cultures and kind of see how it's expressed in different cultures. It's a pretty interesting fact that it can be and should be universal. For the most part, it is universal. Mm-hmm. I think that what's also maybe the inverse of what's universal too is that how often and how the commonality of devaluing of people, and so I think there's two ways we can talk about this today. One is, what does it look like to value somebody? And I think that's probably the best way to go. But I also think there's a conversation around let's point out the ways that we don't value individuals as just human beings.
Sometimes it's helpful to learn by contrast.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I remember there's been some things I've been working on, in mental health law over the last couple of months, and instead of trying to define what it is, we're trying to define what it's not. Yeah. Because that's a lot easier sometimes to pick out, right? And so I think for the same thing, I don't want to go there today, but I think just challenging our listeners to go, okay, if we're trying to think of value, I think it's sometimes our gut reaction, our emotional intelligence picks up the things that aren't right. Yeah. Don't feel right, Right. But we see it all the time. I mean, you turn on the news and you've got, it's Pride Month. And, the news was turned on the other day of this Pride March in Detroit and the neo-Nazis showing up and trying to, and I'm like, okay, why? Yeah. How do we value people when we disagree with them? How do we value people when we don't see eye to eye? How do we value people when they're different than us? Yeah. I think goes into this conversation.
As most of our listeners have caught on by now, I'm a big nerd and love fantasy and sci-fi and all of the bad shows and movies that have come out over the past 70 years. And one common theme that I notice is this theme of the value of life, and you'll end up in a situation where there's this weird, strange alien, and the protagonists are trying to figure out whether that weird, strange alien that is so foreign to our experience of what life is has value because they have thoughts or reasoning or a dream. And I think that what that speaks to is our view that life has value, that the mere existence of a thing comes with an innate value. And I've talked about this before at different speaking engagements, that if you take $100 bill, you can mark it all up. You can run it through the dirt. You can put it in feces. You can whatever.
Put it to the wash to clean it off of the feces.
Right. And no matter what state it's in, it's still worth $100. Right. You can even cut it into 4 pieces, burn one of the 4th pieces, and it's still worth $100. And we don't always see ourselves that way because we think, oh, this bad thing happened to me, or I did this bad thing, and therefore I must only be worth I'm a $95 $100 bill.
Well, that's where I think the idea of shame comes in and that kind of stuff too. But I think, and I think what you're saying, but you haven't said, was the importance that value doesn't mean that we have to agree. Value doesn't mean that we have to even like each other. Like I cannot like you and still go, okay, you're a human being, and there's value, innate value in the fact that you're a human being. So I'm going to treat you well.
Yeah.
Right? We might not be buddies, but I'm going to treat you well. And I think we have completely gone off the rails
very much
in our society.
One example that I like to talk about in this, because it's the extreme side of this concept of the value of personhood, is that innate value doesn't change. It stays at that $100 bill level.
Right.
And so that means that Hitler, Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, some of these people who have done horrific things and all of these things has the same value as the Shakespeare or the Bill Gates or any of these people that we would look at and say, like, yeah, they were good people, or they did good work, or they really achieved great things. And that doesn't mean that we agree with what these men did
or like them right.
or approve of anything.
Right.
But it does mean that when we look at humanity, there's a common thread of innate value.
Well, turn on the news. I mean, any of us that have been around in the last 9, 10, 12, 24 months, we turn on the news and we see protests and riots and people getting beat up because they're wearing a certain color hat that says a certain thing on it, or carrying a sign that says a certain something, right? And we immediately jump to judgment and slander and condescending talk. And I think, I wonder, and this is the challenge that I have for myself and I have for our listeners, and I'd love, for our country to look at this too, going, what would it look like if we realized the value of humanity, of the person sitting across from us, regardless of sexual orientation, gender, race, religion, and just go, okay, you have value because you're a human being, and I'm going to treat you with a certain level of respect and engage you with a certain level of respect, even if we differ, because there's value in that. I think obviously, the world would be a better and a different place if that was the case. But why do you think we don't do that? Why do you think we quickly overlook or push aside the value of somebody?
Well, and I think some of that in my mind, and part of it's just because I've been doing episode planning, it ties into what we'll talk about next week of why we seek power. And like continuing with our concept of like learning by contrast, I think the ability to devalue or the effects of that and why it's important to talk about this subject is that's where slavery comes from. That's where sex trading or the
sex trafficking
comes from.
Or just trafficking in general.
Right. Bullying in high school, like it all comes from this
abuse,
this heart of not seeing the value in another person. And I think some of that is I think one aspect, there are so many different aspects, but one aspect could probably be that the devaluer felt devalued at one time.
Or doesn't see value in themselves.
Or doesn't see, Because we look at abusers, and there's a high likelihood that an abuser has been abused.
Well, yeah, it goes back to your conversation about the value of, even if it's a Hitler or a Manson, I think for those of us that are into history, realizing their lives were not at all, they weren't valued in any stretch of the imagination. And and that goes back to our conversation for next week of why do we seek power is it's making up for something. And I think if I can treat you poorly and it somehow makes me feel good about myself, I'm going to keep doing it.
Yeah.
And because I don't want to look at myself and go, why am I X,
And I think some of it ties into the concept of survival of the fittest, which has its place and doesn't have its place. Because I think when we look at it in a relationship style, that can become very ferocious.
Sure.
And as higher reasoning beings, human beings, it makes more sense to think about things from a philosophical perspective that what's good for the group is good for me also.
Yeah, so I'm going to throw that out. But I agree with you. And then you look at reality TV, The Bachelor, The Bachelorette. You look at Big Brother or Survivor, and the survival of the fittest piece. The how can I one up somebody else?
Yeah.
How can I manipulate, cheat, steal? It's just a fascinating concept, and I think it goes to our humanness as well, right? That we are. It goes to a different conversation that we could have maybe about are people born good or are we born bad and strive for good or what, the age-old conversation. Right. But the value of someone, like you said, I think the $100 bill concept is a fascinating concept. So I think my big question though is there a universal definition of value? Because I could say, you know what, I value my car, right? And to me, that means take your shoes off when you get in. I'm going to shampoo the carpets every weekend. I'm going to take a Q-tip into the, air vents and that kind of stuff. And you could say, you know what, I value my car too, and I wash it once every 6 months. Right. But I change the oil and I take care of it that way. Does my definition of value trump yours? Yeah. And so I don't know. Do you think we do have a universal definition of value, or is it relative? I
don't think that we do have a universal one, and I think that's one of the reasons that we see so much strife. I think that, and some of this comes from my own ideology and spirituality. I think that there is a universal definition of value that is given to us as living people. And that when we can align ourselves to that concept, it makes it easier to have these conversations. But I think that ultimately, if we look at even just the basic human rights that we've come to as a planet in understanding,
which varies very widely, but
it does. Yeah. But overall, there is this general concept that most people can agree to. So the UN, I believe after World War II, came up with their Declaration of Human Rights.
I think it's been modified probably and expanded upon, right?
But I would be surprised if it hadn't. But I think there are a couple that make a lot of sense to me. And the first one is we are all born free and equal.
Or should be.
Or should be. And these are saying these are the things that every human should have the right to. And it's not saying this is what is, but what should be.
That makes sense.
And so it's laying out the groundwork of what the value of a person is. And so it starts with being
free and
equal. And then they talk about we're not discriminating. So it's the ability to see people for their differences and to honor those differences rather than to choose to serve one person because of that difference and another to not serve because of a different difference. And then the right to life, which I think, would make more sense to be first.
Right.
So the right to life, and then that no person deserves slavery or torture. And I think, there's 30 of them, and
I think it's the Office of Human Rights Council is what you would look up, ohchr.org or something like that, to look at them. I think it's interesting for all of us to go through and kind of look through. It's the whole preamble.
Right. And I don't think, I don't see this as this is the universal law and it should be followed by everybody. But I think it is a really good diving board into this discussion of, can we agree to a couple of these really basic ones that we are all free and equal? The equal part, I think, is really hard. And when we lose that, we find slavery.
Well, and it goes into the conversation that we have for next week, too, of why do we seek power? It's if we don't consciously utilize this framework or the framework of value, we're always going to look for a way to one up somebody. Yeah. And we'll talk about that next week. But it's not these conversations are not unique to our present day.
No.
And if you study history, you go back as far as, 2,000, 3,000, I mean, just how many years ago, and look at different civilizations and their desire to conquer somebody else because of their differences, or, and not looking at the value. Then you look at, what happened in, the Civil War, and then you look at what happened in, why people came over from England to the United States. It was escaping persecution.
Yeah.
You look at World War II, you look at World War I, you look at, I think the intent behind the Gulf War and Iraqi freedom, and obviously we can debate this until we're blue in the face.
Right.
But
and there are individuals who have.
Right, exactly. But
go watch them if you're really interested in those arguments.
Right. But we look at all that and going, okay, why did these things start? Well, it's because one group or subgroup of people were being marginalized.
Yeah.
Why do you think we have the different movements and marches? Why do we have Black Lives Matter? Why do we have the Pride March? Why do we have, pro-life, pro-choice? I mean, you fill in the blank, and it's going, well, because a certain group is being marginalized or overlooked. And it's interesting because we sometimes have judgment around these different movements. But if we were to come back to the reasons for them, it was because they're trying to reclaim value.
Yeah.
And it makes perfect sense. I might be disagreed with on our listeners.
Well, it might be a simplified way of looking at things, but that is what we're focused on, and we want to show that maybe it's just one root of the problem.
Sure.
But it is a part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we come to the close, maybe we just talk a little bit about a few ways that we can today start to see the value in other people and act in a way that is honoring of that value.
I'm going to challenge our listeners in this. It starts with us. Do you find value in yourself? If you don't, I'm sorry, but you're not going to be able to find value in other people. You might think you are, but it could be condescending. It could be marginalizing. It could be manipulative. But I think it starts with us. And I know it might be a little bit too simplistic here, but how in what ways do you value yourself? And I'm not thinking prideful, haughty, cocky type of thinking. I'm thinking about just true value. Do you value yourself? Do you take care of yourself? Do you love yourself in a way that is healthy? If you don't, obviously I'm going to advocate for counseling.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of my obviously go-to. But if you do, I think then you're going to be able to start pulling it out of others. You're going to start seeing it in others. You know?
And I'd encourage our listeners to go and listen to our episode on humility, because we talk a little bit about this beautiful middle ground between self-deprivation and pride. And I think that ties into the way we see ourselves and our value, because either side of that spectrum will lead to us treating others in a skewed way.
Well, I also think, too, it goes back to maybe start from episode 1 and how to have a conversation. How do you, because I think we've, season 1, episode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we kind of lay the foundation of this idea of how to have a conversation. And I think if you are wanting to really begin to find value in others, go back to the basics.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of why we started this podcast to begin with, is what we really want to encourage and guide individuals towards something that is almost unique nowadays of, we disagree? Okay, let's talk.
Yeah.
And it's because I respect you. I value myself. I understand, and it's all these things that we've been talking about for so long.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, like I said, one of the roots.
Right.
In that tree of the conversations we want to have.
So let's go back to how we started. Your mom says the preciousness of others, right? And I think that's a fantastic framework. What would she say in the sense, or how have you maybe assimilated her conversations and her raising you over the last 26 years, to answer that question?
Yeah. Well, a lot of hers came from a Christian background of they were made in the image of God, and if God loves them, you should love them as well. And I still think that is true. And also, it has grown for me in just acknowledging that I don't have rights over other people. And a lot of my struggle as a kid was I would bully people because they didn't do what I wanted them to do, and recognizing that they didn't have to do what I wanted them to do. They were their own people. Right. And so coming to a place where I recognize my place in the world and that I can have influence, but I can't control, I can't rule. Which will tie in pretty well into next week's episode, why we crave power. Because that was probably at the heart. It was both of these conversations mixed up. I didn't see the value in others, and I wanted to have power, and it was easy for me to attain.
Sure, but we'll come back to that next week. Yeah, I think when we do that, I've been there too. We're trying to piece ourselves up.
Yeah,
this conversation can go on for a while, but I hope that it has inspired you to begin thinking about how you value those in your life and the ways that you need to reorient that to look at even yourself.
Yeah. We'll catch you next week.
Thank you for joining Candid Conversations. If you would like more information, you can email candid@mayfieldcounseling.com or call 719-452-4803.